Good afternoon again to all the participants. Thank you so much for joining us for today's workshop titled Writing Book Chapters and Books. And good afternoon to you, Prof. Siseko Kumalo. And thank you so much for honoring our invite to facilitate such an important topic. Most of us, aspire to write books and to get our books published. So thank you so much for honoring our invite, and thank you so much for accepting and for agreeing to facilitate this topic. And I just wanted to please, can I get a thumbs up from all the participants? If you can hear me, Prof, can you hear me perfectly? And all the participants? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. My name is Lawrence Asani. I'm from the Research Capacity Development Unit at the Postgraduate School, University of Johannesburg, and I am delighted to be your moderator for today's workshop. Just a disclaimer that this workshop is also being recorded, and the presentation slides of this workshops, as Prof. Siseko said, he will share with us the slides, and we will share it with all the participants who have joined us today, together with this workshop recording as well. Just to go over a few housekeeping rules. If you do have any question during the chat during the session, please kindly raise your virtual hand, and or if you do not wish to speak, please kindly type your question in the chat box. As Prof. Seko says, he wants this to be a very engaging rather workshop. So let's try to make it interactive as much as possible as we can. And also just to note that I will be posting a feedback survey in the chat section. So please kindly fill it in as we use this for our reporting purposes, as well as to share it with our facilitator, Prof. Siseko. Just also to note that we also use this feedback survey to generate a certificate of attendance for this workshop. So please kindly fill it in with your correct details, which is your name, your surname, your student number, your email address, so that we send it with the right information and to the right email as well. So before we can begin, or before I can introduce Prof. Siseko to you, please kindly allow me to read over Prof. Siseko's very rich bio, rather. Please allow me to just read over his bio. So, Prof. Siseko Kumalo is a political theorist and higher education scholar whose work sits at the intersection of African philosophy, decolonial critique, and feminist theory. His scholarship is anchored in a deep commitment to transforming the politics of knowledge, challenging exclusionary, traditional, expanding intellectual horizons, and reimagining the university as a space of liberation. He served as the founding editor of the Journal of Decolonizing Disciplines and the visionary behind the Black Archive Project, a groundbreaking initiative that surfaces marginalized epistemic traditions and cultivates new generation critical thinkers. His ultimate ambition is a new Edo of Che in the Black Archive, ensuring the long-term institutional future of this work. Professor Seko currently is an associate professor at the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and Professor Seko contributes to curriculum policy, higher education transformation, and public discourse in decolonization. He has published widely in leading journals as a Theoria, Crystal, and the Sage Handbook of African Philosophy, and has presented his work on global stages, including the United Nations Summit for the Future and Nishan World Forum. So you can hear yourself, Prof. Kumalo there, with such rich bio. Who else but to facilitate such an important workshop for us, writing book chapters and books. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Prof. Kumalo. You may now proceed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lawrence. I just wanted to find out, can everybody hear me? Just a thumbs up will do.
Just a thumbs up from the participants if you can hear Prof. Kumalo. Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
I think, yeah, I see a few thumbs up. I think we'll hear you. You may proceed, Prof.
Thank you so much. I want to start off with a question. I did indicate to Lawrence that Yeah, first of all, let me preface my remarks with this. I did indicate to him that I am traveling, and so at the moment I am in East London. And in between my travel and preparing for today, I have seemingly misplaced my slides. So I would like this conversation for this afternoon to be a very interactive conversation. However, though, the slides will then be followed up for all of those who are in attendance in the room today. So I do apologize for the bit of a mix-up. As I say, I can't seem to quite locate my slides for today's conversation, but they will follow probably by tomorrow at the very, very latest. Before we get started, I just want to sort of get a sense from the room, at what level we are in terms of our graduate studies. For example, are we masters? Are there any masters candidates in the room, doctoral candidates in the room? And are there any postdoc fellows by any chance? We can either just unmute or we can sort of put it in the chat. I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to this afternoon, if folks are okay with that.
Okay, so to all the participants, you can kindly type your questions in the chat. You can type your responses in the chat box, or you can unmute your mic and speak. So I've allowed everybody's mic, so you can just unmute your mic as well and speak, or you can type your response in the chat box. Okay, here there are some responses in the chat box. Do you want me to read them out for you, Prof, or you can see them?
Sure, sure. I see
Okay,
that we've got an MSc in research science.
okay.
Doctoral, Mfundo Zwane. Another PhD student.
I'm a PhD student myself.
Aha, okay. Thanks, Lawrence. Thanks for
Good
that.
afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah,
Uh,
I thought I should unmute myself because I understand how it is to present and nobody is really responding to you.
Thank
But
you so much.
am Kagiso, I am Kagiso Tukisi. I am a doctorandus. I have my results ready now. So yes.
Excellent.
Oh,
Congratulations, Kakiso. Congratulations.
congratulations.
Yeah. Other folks. So I'm assuming that the majority of the people in the room are doctoral students. Kagiso, I'm going to pick on you because you decided to unmute your mic for us. So thank you for breaking the ice. I wonder if you've published during the course of your graduate studies. Have you actually done any publishing?
Yes, I have done publishing. I have actually published 9 articles, 3 from my PhD and 6 from my master's.
Good, good. And the question is being put to the room as well of those of us who are currently pursuing our doctoral studies, even the master's candidates, I think it would be interesting to find out if any of you have dabbled in the game of publishing. So we've got one affirmative. Mfundo says he's got one in progress. Mfundo says they've got one in progress. Apologies for gendering people. Anybody else? Lawrence, what about you?
I'm also working on 2 papers with my supervisor as well. Yeah,
Okay.
from my master's work.
Okay.
As I just
Okay.
literally graduated this year for my master's. So I'm just only beginning. I'm in the beginning of my PhD studies.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Cool. So we've got about 3 folks then in the room who have one person who's got experience in publishing, and then 2 other folks who are sort of starting out in the publication process. Is that correct?
Yes, we also have Mfundo says is in progress. Then
Yeah.
Zibope in progress as well.
Yeah.
Damilola is a master student. So yeah.
Okay. So the reason I asked this is because I am going to be a bit personal in the sense of share my own experience here with publishing. I began in the realm of research, I think when I was 15 years old. I did my first research article for the South African Institute of International Affairs, SIA, based at Wits University. At the time, South Africa was hosting the, what do they call it? I think it was COP 17, right? And SIA had run this really, really interesting national competition. And they said to us that, it's going to be cool, for example, if school learners could be able to put together a research paper. And they gave us the draft for a research paper. And as I said, I was 15 at the time. And I suppose I'm aging myself now at this point. For those who are quick with their maths and their numbers, they'll be able to figure out how old I am. I'm a little ancient, maybe not. But anyway, so I was 15 when I did my first research paper. And I remember the instruction was there should be teams of 3 to 4 learners. And I was very excited about the opportunity, so I dove straight into it. And I had 2 other fellow learners who had worked with me on our debating team at Maritzburg College. And I sort of just said, okay, fine, I'm going to work on the paper, and I'm going to have them come in as critical commentators, etc., etc. And the paper went quite far in the sense that, so there was a national pool, and those national pools were then whittled down to provincial best 5 papers. And from those provincial teams, there were sets of teams from province, 2 teams per province that were then taken up to the Conference of the Parties conversation that was happening at the time in Durban. And I had an incredibly exciting experience with this. One of the English teachers that I was working with at school, who had sort of acted as a supervisor on the project, had finished, I think she had done an MA at Oxford. And so I'd worked with her quite closely to sort of be my critical reader, giving me critical feedback on the argument, on the sensibility of the claims that were being made in the argument, etc. I say that to sort of give the foreground to the point that I then published my first paper in February of 2017. And I had worked on that paper during my 3rd year. So February 2017, I was in my honors year at Rhodes University. And in the course of my undergraduate training, I had done, I think, about plus minus 5 conferences, the majority of which were held at Rhodes University. And from those conferences, I had then also, in subsequent years, was able to publish research articles from that. So, for example, if you go onto my Google Scholar page, Defining an African Vocabulary, for example, which appears in Alternations, which is published by UKZN Press, was initially presented at the South African Association or Sociological Association of South Africa, right? And that was that was initially published, or that was presented at SIA, I think, I think it was 2016, if not 2017, I'm not too sure. And then it appeared in Alternations in 2018. A lot of the arguments that I sort of developed in my undergraduate years through conference attendance came out quite extensively in my first year of my master's program, which was in 2018, where I was at the University of Pretoria, also kind of holding this other hat, as I say, of the founding as my journal edit, as my biography indicates, as the founding editor of the Journal of Decolonizing Turbulence. So I really had, as a as a child, genuinely, I had a fascination with and about research, and I was exceptionally excited about research. So one of the things that I want you to hold in your mind is to sort of think about the fact that I've had roughly more than a decade of experience in the research domain in South Africa, and I have had both the inner workings of sort of doing the publishing business from the perspective of working with the journal, setting up a journal, and the work that we did with that journal ended up creating the offshoot of the Emerging Scholars Initiative publication house in the humanities faculty at the University of Pretoria. So, there's an extensive set of experiences that one brings to particular conversation. Now, Lawrence asked me to come here today and talk to you guys about developing books and book chapters. But I do want to sort of start off by giving you the lay of the land, which is to say, what are some of the considerations that you've got to be thinking about as you're developing your graduate research, and how do you turn your graduate research into knowledge that quote unquote participates in the broader domain production in South Africa and globally, right? So I don't know how many of us prizes more so journal publications than it does books, for example, a monograph or book chapters. There are a number of reasons behind that. The fundamental reason behind it, I would suggest, is that a journal article is able to impact far quicker, for example, than, for example, you would have a book chapter or a monograph for that matter. Because remember, a book chapter, or for example, or even for that matter, a monograph specifically requires critical review. It needs to be sort of located within continuing conversation. And I would argue that as a quote unquote scholar, it would be unwise of you to say, I've just finished my PhD, I'm going to publish my PhD as a monograph, right? There are two reasons why I say don't do that. The first is to say nobody in your field really knows your name, not extensively in any case. And how do you determine if the field that you're working in knows your name? That's where neoliberal, as some folks would critique and say, I'm not one who is averse to quote unquote the neoliberal practices of the modern university. I do think that they are able to allow us to track very, very credible intricacies within the system. So, however, the conversation around is how many individuals are actually citing and engaging with your scholarship. So I'm going to go back to Kagiso here, who's actually done quite a bit of work, who's published extensively, both from his master's and his doctoral research. Kagiso, I'm just curious to find out from you, what's been the uptake of your scholarship in the sense of, are people engaging with your work? Are people citing your work? What are your citation metrics looking like? Do you care to share that with us?
Thank you, Prof. I think people are slowly but surely engaging with my work. I have checked, and then I'm sitting with 17 citations now, but I only started publishing in 2021.
So and so just before I let you go, could you just give us a bit of a context in the sense of which particular discipline you're situated in by any chance?
Oh, I am in the midwifery and neonatal nursing sphere.
Aha, so you're in nursing sciences.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. And then I suppose the folks who have stuff in progress, I wonder if anybody's actually got stuff out. Like, do we have publications out, and would anybody care to share their experiences about how their work is being taken up, and do they have any citations? Do we have any takers? No takers. Okay. So if you're feeling a little shy, it's fine. If you feel comfortable along the discussion, please feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand, unmute, and make a contribution. So the reason why I asked the question of what discipline Kagiso is in, for example, is because different disciplines will read citation numbers differently, right? So for example, let's say we've got some folks who are in African languages, right? African languages is a uniquely, and I mean absolutely uniquely South African discipline. And if you think about the number of academics in the South African higher education space who are publishing and who are actively developing that particular area of scholarship, it's a small community, right? So you'll see, for example, senior professors in the African languages cluster in South Africa. If somebody's really pushing high numbers, they're probably reaching to about 800, maybe 1,500 citations. And that's like somebody who's like a hard hitter. That's somebody who you don't write an article and don't cite them because probably they've done really seminal work in the field, right? Which is quite different, for example, than from something like, say, political sciences, my own discipline, right? Political sciences, specifically working in political theory. And there you're going to have a number of quote unquote subdisciplines. So, for example, you've got international relations and political sciences, you've got political theory in political science, you have political economy in political science. So, there are all of these different subcomponents, right? And political science is not a quote unquote uniquely South African discipline. And so, insofar as you're reading political science or political theory, in my context, in any case, if you're reading political theory numbers, what you've got to be thinking about here is to say, is this person, quote unquote, being cited in the industry? Are they being engaged in the discipline? Are their arguments latching on, right? In terms of the conversations, the existing conversations that they wish to join in political science, i.e., in their discipline. Now, why do I bring up the number of metrics, right? I bring it up to drive the point home around, quote unquote, your being known in the discipline. We can always translate the figures that you have, for example, on your Google Scholar citations to how well you are known and how familiar people are with your research in the area / discipline that you're working in. All right. If your numbers are depressed in I saw that, for example, there was one particular candidate in the room who's an MSc, um, what is it, MSc candidate doing research for their work. Now, you have, for example, in the sciences, major numbers, right, that you don't usually see in disciplines, for example, of the humanities. It's a similar kind of thing. Um, with other disciplines, for example, in the hard sciences. So you'll see major numbers. Somebody, there's particular scholars, for example, in sciences that will push, and this is someone pushing quote unquote low numbers. You'll see somebody having something like 5,000 citations. Now, if you look at a hard science discipline and a discipline like, for example, philosophy, right, which is the adjacent discipline that I work towards as a political theorist, one of our leading A-rated scholars, a good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, Professor Thaddeus Smets, an A-rated scholar, is pushing 5,000 citations, I believe, on his Google Scholar profile, right? I see an SM. I would just
Sorry,
request that the
participants.
participant mute.
Yes, please. Okay, let me just mute their mics again. Apologies for that, Prof.
Sure. Sure, no worries, Lawrence.
Okay.
Sorted.
Yes, you can carry on, Prof. You can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you look at Thaddeus Smets, right, Thad, I think, has about plus minus, as I say, 6,000 citations in a discipline like philosophy. And those are major numbers. But if you were to read Thad's numbers in the hard sciences, you'd say to Thad is a regular academic who's just doing his work and getting on and putting out research. Now, in the context of his discipline, the kind of work that he does has earned him an A rating with the National Research Foundation, which is to say a lot of folks think about concepts like moral philosophy in the context of the African continent, and the biggest voice that they're thinking about there is Professor Thaddeus Smets, who's based at the University of Pretoria, who was previously at the University of Johannesburg for a number of years in the philosophy department at UJ. When people think about concepts like Ubuntu, again, whether they're thinking about Ubuntu from Europe, whether they're thinking about Ubuntu from South America, from Australia, from the United States of America, they're going to think about Ubuntu. And the first person that they're going to want to cite is Thaddeus Smets, because he's the leading voice in that field. Now, Thaddeus Smets, because of the work that he has done with more than 25 years of work, for example, in the discipline of philosophy, when he brings out a book, his book doesn't get buried, right? In the sense of it doesn't fall into the humdrum of scholarship because, you know, nobody knows him, he doesn't attend conferences, etc., etc. Everybody knows him. So when he says, here's a book, here's a monograph, I'm contributing this to the body of and the body of knowledge globally, people will take a minute, they'll take a listen, they'll look up and they'll say, okay, what's that got to say? He's recently released a very exciting book, for example, I think about 2 years ago, on African moral philosophy, and that was one of the most well-received books on African moral philosophy. In fact, I think it was a critical insertion in African moral philosophy, or in moral philosophy from an African perspective globally. Again, how did Thad do that? He is one of the critical scholars in African philosophy and African philosophical thought globally, right? So as I say, when he releases a text, people are going to want to pay attention to him. People are going to want to listen to him. People are going to want to be interested in what he's got to say. Now, in the context, for example, of, and I think it's going to be useful to use the example of the discipline of philosophy, because if I think about the numbers that philosophers, general philosophers in South Africa are pushing, senior philosophers in South Africa, this is somebody, for example, at the rank of an associate professor or a full professor, you'll find that a lot of the folks in the discipline of philosophy in between 350 to about 1,500 citations over the course of their entire career. Okay. Now, when you have somebody like Thaddeus Smets, who's then going to say, okay, cool, my numbers are 5,000, 6,000 citations, you're seeing that this person is actually, quote unquote, a superstar in the industry, right? Comparatively to the 350 to about 1,500 citations that his colleagues are pushing, right? And again, how do you raise your numbers? You raise your numbers by publishing journal articles. So you begin this conversation, I think, for me in any case, by pushing out journal publications. And you start to really kind of carve out an area for yourself as a scholar to say, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I want to talk about. This is the conversation, or these are the sets of conversations that I want to join. Now, where I become a bit critical, I think, of the neoliberal university, specifically as it manifests in South Africa through the publishing model and the subsidy model of South Africa, is that we will get you as a postdoc, and the majority of postdocs will publish under any particular topic, so long as they've got a unit out. Now, what does that do for your research? Think about the kind of researcher that you want to be. Where are the important conversations happening? Who are the people that you want to be in dialogue with? And how do you establish that dialogue with those people that you want to be in conversation with, right? The first thing that you've got to ask yourself, oh, shucks. Am I back, Lawrence? I think I took a dip there for a second.
Yes, yes, Prof. Yes, we are back. We can hear you perfectly.
Lawrence, can you hear me?
Yes, Prof. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, God.
Prof? Can you hear me now? Hi, Prof. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you now. Am I back?
Yes, you're back. Perfect. We can hear you. And the participants, can you hear, Prof? Please just indicate with a thumbs up. Yes, perfect. You can continue, Prof. Thank you.
I didn't see any thumbs up, Lawrence, but it's fine.
There is a few.
Maybe it's
There
just
is a few. Yes, there is a few, Prof.
maybe it's just my screen.
Yes, yeah.
So where was I? Where did I get cut off, Lawrence? Could you just give me an indication of where you lost me? Lawrence, can you hear me? I think you might be muted still.
Yes, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I was just asking, when did you lose me?
I would lose you so it wasn't so far off from yeah, establishing your presence, writing journal articles. That was yeah.
Okay. Okay. Started by okay, great. Thanks.
Yes,
Thanks,
yes, Prof.
Kagiso.
Yes.
So start establishing your voice by putting out journal articles. Now, the thing that I don't quite like about the quote unquote university in South Africa that is backed up by the subsidy model, right? This is where I become critical of the neoliberal university, is that more often than not, when you get into a postdoc, and this is, you've got to be really careful about this, and I'm speaking here specifically to the likes of Kagiso who've just finished their doctoral programs and who are probably going to be looking for opportunities, um, either through postdocs, etc. If you can get a teaching job, Kagiso, before a postdoc, I would completely suggest that you go in that direction, just because of the reasons that I'm about to cite. A lot of postdocs will tend to want to publish in anything and everywhere, so long as they get the publication out and they get a unit. What's the problem with that? Can anybody tell me what the problem with that is? Please feel free to type in the chat, or Lawrence, you can unmute folks so that folks can just come on this platform and tell us what they think the problem with publishing anything and anywhere is. Like, what's the problem with that?
Yes, participants, please feel free. You can also type in the chat box. If maybe you are shy to speak, or maybe you are shy to unmute your mic, you can just type your questions in the chat box. Let's make this engaging. Let's engage. Let's engage. Let's make this an interactive session. Thank you.
So I'm going to repeat the question. What's the problem with publishing? Okay, yes, problem. But let's say you're savvy enough to say, okay, I'm only going to confine myself to accredited, DHET accredited journals, right? So I think all of us will be aware by now that if you want to sort of publish, the first thing that you do is that you go and you check out where you want to publish, and then you fact check about that journal. You go onto the DHET list, the most updated one for that matter. UJ always publishes an updated annually. They literally, if you say DHET accredited list UJ, you'll get a link that'll take you to the most recent updated DHET list that we have access to as a university. So say, for example, you've done your homework there, and you're saying, okay, cool, I found my journal, it's DHET accredited, but what's still the problem about publishing anything and everywhere? There's a very serious problem here. Anybody? Anybody? Nobody? Do you know what I used to do when I used to teach? I would look in the room and I would pinpoint and I would say, I'm going to ask this person to please answer my question. So let me view all of you and see who I can call up onto the stage.
Seems like we have
Mfundo
quite a tough
Zwane?
crowd.
I know, right?
How tough.
Mfundo, tell me, what do you think probably is the problem with publishing anything as long as it has some vague idea towards your research topic, and publishing it everywhere, right? And again, we've said, okay, fine. We've gotten over the issue of predatory journals. We've made sure that the journal is not predatory. Could you share with us what you think a possible problem with that strategy could be?
Thanks, Prof. And yeah, thank you, or not so thank you for picking on me. Um, so I do think that perhaps an author could lose their credibility, but also the sort of messaging that they would like to put out there also gets lost in translation because all of the other articles may sound like noise, and the main message that they're trying to communicate gets lost in the noise. So for me, it would be perhaps s- them not being able to communicate or contribute as effectively as they can to the conversation because they've just got so many things going on. Yeah.
That is 100%, Mfundo. That is exactly the issue, right? If you're contributing to, say, for example, I now put out a special issue call and I say to you, to all of you in the room, guys, I'm working on decolonization. I need somebody to contribute. I'd like you guys to contribute. If you're not discerning enough about what is my research question, what's the area in which I wish to work, and you put your work out into every single opportunity. Now, of course, there's certain projects that you're going to want to be a part of because you want to collaborate with the people that are in your community, right? And some of those projects you might say, okay, cool, this is not really in my particular niched area of research, but I can be able to align my research to this, right? Um, the problem with putting out stuff everywhere, like absolutely everywhere, is that your unique contribution, as Mfundo tells us, gets diluted. People don't know what is. So the question, you see, if you go back, Lawrence, could you go back just a bit to the slide that you had up? And as Lawrence is calling that up, I'm going to talk through this. If you could go back just to my bio for a quick second. You'll see, for example, that my bio says that I'm a political theorist who works at the intersection of, okay, I forgot it myself now, but I know feminism is in there: feminist theory, decolonial theory, and the Black Archive, right? So those are the three things that if you're thinking about Usisego Khumalo, this is what you're immediately thinking about. Okay, cool. If I want to invite this guy, I want to invite him because I know he can contribute to these kinds of questions, right? If I'm working on this project, I know I want Siseko involved in that project because I know he's defined himself as a leading thinker in those particular areas. I just want to see it. Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you so much for calling this up. There we go. So it says, whose work sits in the intersection of African philosophy, decolonial critique, and feminist theory. Right? That is the fundamental contribution that I am trying to make with my scholarship through the things that I put out there. So you've got to ask yourself the question of, as I'm putting out this particular research piece, is it focusing on the areas of scholarship that I want to be known for? If you're going to put out stuff on technology tomorrow, and you're going to put out stuff on AI the other day, and then you're going to put out stuff on GBV the next day, and then you're going to put out stuff on, I don't know, pedagogic processes or pedagogic strategies in your discipline, the question really becomes a question of, what's your area of research? Like, what is it that you're actually contributing in your area and field of research? And unfortunately, this is the problem that we've created through the development of postdoctoral fellows. It's very, very unfortunate, and I'm not the only one to say this. It is not an ghastly statement to make. My good colleague, Professor Mlamuli Hlatrayo, actually writes about this quite extensively, and he demonstrates the fact that we use postdoc fellows in the university system more broadly, not only as the University of Johannesburg, but broadly across the sector. We use postdoctoral fellows as research mules, right? We mine you for the subsidy and not to develop your actual voice, to develop your area or niche in what you want to do as a researcher, right? So the first primary thing, to go back then, thanks, Lawrence, you can take down the slide. I just wanted that particular aspect of my bio. Thank you so much. So the first thing that you're going to want to ask yourself is to say, how do I establish my voice in the area of scholarship that I want to be known in? And the first is to say, be discerning about where you contribute to. Now, I'm going to ask a second question, which is to say, can anybody give us another option or another avenue of developing your voice as a contributor, as somebody who is making a dent in their particular field? Sfundo, do you want to give us an idea here of what is another alternative? I see Sfundo Mdluli. Sfundo, are you there? Okay, Sfundo doesn't seem to be there. Hunadi? Hunadi Malloy? Also doesn't seem to be there. Rumbidzai? Your colleagues, come now.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for saving me. I thought I was talking to ghosts. Please go ahead, Rumbidzai.
What I think I agree with what Tukisi Kagiso mentioned in the comment section when he said that you might end up publishing and once you end up rushing publications could result in one work not really being impactful. Like you might lose the impactfulness of your writing. That's what I think. I'm not so sure.
Okay, so I agree with you, but you see, you're still focusing on the problem of publishing everywhere and anything. I want to sort of get to a point where now we can sort of think about what are the other alternative avenues whereby, so we've said, okay, fine, be discerning about where we're publishing, craft your area or niche area of contribution. And that means that you don't put out stuff everywhere because indeed you dilute your voice. People don't know what you're talking about. People can't say this is your exact area or niche of scholarship. But I see there's a hand. Damilola, please go ahead.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly, colleague. Please go ahead.
Right. I put my answer in the chat, but I said you could research a subject that is barely covered or not covered at all. Like that's what I'm currently doing, and it's a subject that's not really has some academic coverage, but not plenty of it. That's how I think you could contribute to I can't remember exactly what your question was, but that's my answer.
So remember the question was, how do you define your unique contribution? So you're saying look to whether your area of research is being covered or not. Is that correct?
Yes, something along those lines.
All right. Although, Damilola, I want to push back on that just a little bit by saying, I think there's been an interesting challenge in
Prof?
the contemporary. Lawrence, is that you?
Yes. Do you want me to read out the answers in the chat that he
Yes,
put?
please. If you could monitor the chat for me, that'd be great. Because I'm just
Okay.
looking at the participants' names, Lawrence. So that would be really, really wonderful. Could I just respond though to Damilola's response quickly? So what we've seen happening over the last decade in higher education, specifically in graduate studies, and in disciplines that are not in the sciences, because remember that prior to the 18th century, so this was in 1756, the university was not professionalized as it has become professionalized today. The university existed, and the work of Bill Reddings actually does this quite nicely. He distinguishes between three institutions. He distinguishes between, for example, the German University of Reason, where philosophy was the reigning paradigm of thought, the English or British University of Culture, where literature and the culture of letters was the predominant prevailing idea. And I think he also uses Harvard University, my own alma mater, where he thinks about how Harvard was a bridge between the German and the British models of education as we had seen them on the European continent in the New World. Now, when the university professionalized in the 18th century, as I say, so this is 1756 onwards, moving forwards, what begins to happen is that we break up the disciplines, right? And we say within the Humboldtian University, within the University of Letters, i.e. in Britain, we say to them, okay, you've got to have the natural sciences, you've got to have mathematics, you've got to have all of these different faculties and subdisciplines that have to have tangible, relatable responses to society, right? In the fast forward from 1756 to the early 2000s, the disciplines that found themselves outside of this quote unquote bridge to societal impact wanted the prestige that then came with the sciences, because the sciences could say, this is tangibly what we're doing in society to improve the lives of people. We're researching drugs that are going to stop the spread of HIV and AIDS. We're researching drugs that are combating the spread of tuberculosis. We're researching procedures, medical procedures that can assist in heart transplants, et cetera, et cetera. So the disciplines of the humanities, arts, and sciences adopted or wanted that prestige that came with those other disciplines, right, of the natural sciences. And what the majority of your professors will say to you and your supervisors is that you shouldn't be reading work that is 10 years old. Now that, for me, is a genuine mistake. Because in the disciplines of the humanities, arts, and sciences, you will think that a conversation is not happening in your discipline, and yet it took place, for example, in 1802. Just saying. Because you're not reading the history of your discipline, because you're not reading quote unquote old scholarship, it's outdated, it's not relevant. You're going to think you're inventing a wheel, whereas maybe there's no wheel to be invented. So I just want to push back to you on that to say, when you're finding yourself in a situation where you're in an area of research that's classically under-researched, or there's no conversation that's happening, think about where your timelines are, right? You want to roll yourself back maybe to say, what if I look 50 years before? What if I look 100 years before? What were there similar conversations that were happening to the kind of conversation that I want to take a part in or to be a part of right now? Because the other conversation here is, if the conversation never happened in your area of research, then what conversation would you be joining? Right? And you only begin to establish your own conversations once you're an established scholar per se. Okay. Damilola, could we go to the comments? Not Damilola, Lauren, sorry. Could we go to the comments and see how else we could be able to style ourselves and uniquely define our own voices in the areas of research that we're working in?
Okay, I think I might have maybe responded to this as well from Kagiso. He says you are most likely going to publish in a less impact journal, but then rushing publication could result in one's work not really being impactful. Then from Damilola says issues of plagiarism or forgery could arise. You could research a subject that is barely covered or not covered at all.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
So again, these are the dangers of publishing anything and everywhere, right? And once you've said, okay, fine, I'm defining myself to this area of research, this is how I'm going to be unique, this is how I'm going to discern where I put my work. The next opportunity or the next step is to say, which community is actually talking about the stuff that I'm interested in researching, which means that you're going to look for symposia, for example, annual symposia that talk to your topic. You're going to want to attend conferences, right? Because remember, what are we after? We're after putting your work out there so that you can get known. So the first thing I think that we're getting in answering my first question is to say that what it is that you're known for should be rich, right? It should have depth. It shouldn't be shallow. It should have gravitas. You should be able to be making a contribution that's actually worthwhile and meaningful, right? Now, the next chat is to say, well, where's my crowd of people, right? Who are the people that are talking about these kinds of conversations? Now, to just make a very interesting example, and this is why I say when you begin to start, when you carve out a new area of scholarship, you're usually doing that at a senior level. The reason why I say that is because you've probably read what people are writing, and you've probably come to the conclusion that actually this person is in history, but they're actually helping me to think about this particular problem, even though I'm situated in philosophy. This person is in political science or political economy, and they're writing about stuff that's helping me to answer a question that I'm thinking about in political philosophy. That person is in drama. That person is in English. And so you begin to create and forge a community to attract people to your research area, to your areas of research, or to your areas, or to your questions that you're pursuing in research. And to practicalize that, for example, a lot of the work that I've done for the past couple of years has been on the whole decolonization conversation. But I've grown wary of decolonization because I've found that a lot of the scholarship often stops at the level of this is what's wrong with the contemporary university, it's neo-colonial, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. So we're seeing a lot of criticism of the university, and we're not seeing new generative ideas. And I resultantly then started reading outside of my discipline, right? Which is, again, philosophy. So I went to the anthropologists, I went to the literary scholars, I went to the historians, I went to the political theorists, and I said, okay, who's who in the zoo, right? And then as a result of that, I brought a team of scholars together under the banner of the Black Archive Workshop, right? Where we have got some of the most leading and exceptional minds in jurisprudence. For example, Professor Tshepo Madlingozi, who's one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission in South Africa. He's in jurisprudence, and he's been thinking about the kinds of questions I've been thinking about, but from a perspective of jurisprudence. Another colleague of ours at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Ntando Sindane, who's a copyright specialist, right, in law, has been thinking about questions of copyright law from an indigenous perspective. And I'm like, oh my gosh, he's also thinking about these kinds of questions. I should speak to him. There's another colleague of ours who's sitting at UWC, Dr. Katlego Chale. He's in the English and Literature department there, but he's a dramatologist by training, and he's a theater performer. And he's been thinking about innovative ways of imagining beyond the decolonial critique using theater and jazz, for example. So you only, I think, at some point begin to see or create your own conversation once you've sort of canvassed the entire area and said, okay, here are these different people. They're all working in different disciplines. You see, I've mentioned jurisprudence, I've mentioned copyright law, I've mentioned literature and dramatology. Their colleagues, for example, Professor Ian McQueen, who's at the University of Pretoria. He's a historiographer by training. And he's also asking similar questions of how do we teach historiography in different ways, breaking with the tradition of how we've taught historiography in South Africa for the past, I don't know, 50 to 100 years type of thing. That's another person that we want at the table. So these are very different disciplines, but they're all contributing to the same conversation, right? So the chat here is, once you've said, I want to contribute something of gravitas, something of potent potential for my community of scholars, you then say, okay, who are the people that I can talk to who are having similar conversations, even if they're not in my discipline, right? Even if they're located in a completely different discipline. So these are the two things that you do to establish your name, right? To establish your identity, to tell us what it is that you're interested in, what it is that you're working with, and why it is we should take you seriously when you're contributing to that area of research. And as I say, we read how effective you are in your discipline, in your area of research by looking at, again, who are the people that you're in conversation with, who's citing your scholarship. And some of those people are not necessarily, again, going to be in your own discipline. Just the other day, for example, another sort of anecdotal example. I got an email from a colleague of mine who's in Poland, who was saying to me, please contribute to this Routledge anthology that we're doing. We're working on the scholarship of Zoe Wickham. We know you've written about Zoe Wickham, and you've done so in very, very curious and exciting and interesting ways. We would like to invite you to be one of the critical contributors and voices. So once you've started carving out your area and your contribution, and it's a solid and strong contribution, you're going to start having people noticing you. They're going to cite your work. They're going to invite you to speak. They're going to invite you to conferences. They're going to invite you to contribute, right? That's when you know that your scholarship is actually punching and making the right noises that you want. And that is when I would suggest you would be ready to now say, okay, cool, I'm ready to do a book, right? Prior to that moment, if you take your PhD and you turn your PhD immediately as you finish with it and you say, okay, cool, I'm going to now make this into a book, you're really risking the problem, or you're risking the potential of having your PhD findings, your PhD research fly into the quote unquote abyss, as it were, because the question is, who's going to read you when you haven't cultivated a community of scholarship, when you haven't cultivated a community of intellectuals who are interested in the work that you're interested in? Are there any questions so long? I see that we are at 3 o'clock and we're supposed to finish at 4. So I just want to stop here for now and just ask if there are any questions, if there are any clarificatory points before I proceed to the problems or the challenges that you might face with developing and devising a monograph. Are there any questions, colleagues?
Prof, at this point, there isn't any questions in the chat box and there is no hands raised. So
Okay.
I would assume we can proceed, Prof. Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. So what are the challenges with devising a monograph? So we've already said one of the big primary problems here is that if you devise a monograph and you don't have a community that's going to engage your monograph, the probability is that you're going to bury your scholarship, right? And remember, a lot of us are very proud of our doctoral dissertations and theses. We're very, very excited about that work, and we want to get it out there. We want to push it. If you remember, some of you might not be too familiar with the work that is being done, for example, by the Council on Higher Education. But the CHE back in 2021, 2022 put out a report thinking about the state of graduate training in South Africa. And one of the critical things that was noted was the fact that a lot of people are getting PhDs in South Africa, but that is not translating into research that comes into the knowledge economy, right? So, for example, you'll get your PhD, you cross the stage, rah, here you are, you're now a doctor, but then your PhD sits on a file, on a cloud somewhere in your university's server. Or if you're one of the older and more traditional folks, you'll print out your PhD, you'll bind it, and you'll have it in your study, and you'll gift it to your supervisor, etc., etc. But it never translates to anything beyond that, which then sort of poses the really critical question for us, which is to say, why then are we training students at the doctoral level in South Africa if that doctoral training is not going to actually translate to knowledge development for our economy? So one of the challenges then is to say, you can then say to yourself, oh, great, I'm actually going to do something with my PhD. I'm going to put it into a book. But if you don't have a community, ask yourself the question of who's going to read that book. Because the way that the South African model works is that we don't have publicists in the first instance. So you're not going to have a quote unquote marketing strategy beyond what the in-house press is going to say. Number two, because you don't have the reputation, the possibility of you getting a really, really reputable, strong publishing house is going to be hard, right? Because what serious publishers in any case want to see is that they want to see that they're going to invest their money, because it costs a lot of money for a publisher to say, I'm going to invest in this particular book. It costs a lot of money for them. So they want to see that they're going to take something to market that's actually going to sell. They're not just doing it because the government is subsidizing them, which is the problem in South Africa, I do think, is that the state subsidy model is what funds this kind of machine that keeps on going, without really thinking about what the implications or where the products of that machine land up, right? So you can sign a deal, you can sign a book deal with South African publishers, and many of them are very well respected and they're quite good. But the majority, or the reality of it is, the majority of the scholarship ends up really only ever in a number of bookshelves in the country. At best, you're going to sell 26 copies to the 26 public universities, because every library is going to say, okay, cool, we actually want a copy of that book. Beyond that, who's actually engaging with your scholarship? Who is reading you, right? And this is a major, major challenge for our system. Two colleagues have their mics on. I wonder if they have anything to contribute, Mfundo and Mpho. Okay, I think it's just
Yes, it's muted, Prof. Apologies.
thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect.
No worries. No worries, Lance. Thank you so much. So what you really want to think about here is to say, do I have a strong enough academic profile that when I release a book, it's going to get the reviews, it's going to get the attention, the requisite attention and engagement that it needs? And this is one of the reasons why I'll often say to people, if you're going to start out with a book, it's best to start out with a global publisher. Now, again, who are the useful, quote unquote, nice global publishers? In South Africa, we do respect the quote unquote mass production publishers, Routledge, Palgrave, Pan Macmillan, those kind of guys. But if you want your scholarship to be legible in spaces across the entire higher education global sphere, you are going to want your first book to be with a really solid academic press. There's a distinction between a commercial press, i.e. Routledge, Palgrave, as I say, Pan Macmillan, those kinds of guys, and an academic press. Your academic presses are your Harvard University presses, Oxford University Press, what's this other one? Bloomington, right? At Indiana University Press. What's the other one? Anthem, for example, in the United Kingdom is but another one. Blackwell Publishers, those are strong academic publishers, right? That you are going to want to bag if you're going to want to put out your first book. Why? Ask yourself the question of, why do you want those guys when you want your first academic book? The first thing is that those guys are going to take your scholarship and they're going to plug it in various areas. They're going to promote it at conferences that are specifically targeted for your area of research. They're going to put you in conversation with academics that are respectable and reputable in your area of research, who are senior to you, who will help to give your book the requisite attention that it needs. They are going to be able to advise you, for example, to say, okay, cool, these are the different awards that we can put the book up for. A commercial publisher, on the other hand, is not interested in that, right? A commercial publisher is just interested in, okay, cool, we've done the book, let's sell it, let's see how many copies we can get sold on the market. Whereas an academic publisher is going to be thinking about the strategies that also help to facilitate your academic profile's development. If, for example, you put out a book and you get a prize for that book, an academic prize for that book in your field, that is to indicate that this is a book that we've got to take seriously, which means that the publisher is selling more copies, number one. Number two, you're getting more people engaged in your scholarship. Number three, that means that your citations are also going to come out of that book and you're not burying your scholarship. So you see the difference between somebody who has a reputation, who can land a reputable academic press, versus somebody who's just gotten out of graduate training, has a bare minimum of a reputation, doesn't have those contacts and global connections that can be able to give their book that profile. Do you see how these two different people, the one can bury their scholarship and it might be the best thing since sliced bread. The other one can actually push their scholarship, even though it might be nothing more than, I don't know, another boiled potato type of thing. Do you see what I mean? And yet the credibility here stems from the fact that this one has taken a time to develop their identity, to develop their scholarship, to develop their profile before putting that book out. And this one was like, oh, cool, I'm done. Let me put the book out, right? Now, this has implications, especially if you're going to stay in the South African higher education system and you're going to want to be rated, for example, by people such as the National Research Foundation. If you want a P rating as a scholar, for example, the critical thing that is going to be asked is, do you have global contacts, global connections, global networks, a global infrastructure? Right? If you want a P rating, if you want a B/A rating, those are the critical questions that are going to be asked once again, which is to say, what global networks have you been able to grow and to cultivate? And that comes from this discernment of, where am I publishing? With whom am I publishing? What am I publishing on? And then more importantly, who are the people that I'm in conversation with who are having similar conversations as the one that I want to make myself known for? I see that there's a comment in the comment section. Okay, we're following. Thanks, Kagiso. So these are the kinds of questions that you really have to keep in mind as you're thinking about, should I do the book and when do I release the book, right? Now, again, I'm going to now take us to some of the challenges, right? So we've seen what it means to put a book out as soon as you're out of graduate school versus what it means to put a book out when you've got an established reputation as a scholar. South African universities historically don't count single-authored books as strongly towards subsidy as multiple journal articles. And this, of course, is a perverse sort of effect of policy. So policy puts more emphasis on your journal publications as opposed to a book. So again, if you're putting your book out, the other issue as well here is that if you're going to take your PhD study and you're going to translate that into a book, a lot of publications are not going to want to reprint your work, right? So what you've now done, say, for example, you've just finished your PhD, you land a publishing deal. And again, this is these are good publishers. You land a good publication deal with a Routledge or so, you put your work into that book gets buried, and then somebody somewhere, says to you, oh, I've read your stuff, it's really cool, I want to invite you to this. And then you start sort of getting attention maybe 3 years post your doctoral study, right? And post the publication of the book. So maybe say 6 years post the publication of your doctoral study, 4 years after the publication of the book. The problem when somebody invites you is that you have now, by the way, signed over rights to the publishing house. And a lot of people, because again, you're an emerging voice, a lot of folks are not going to allow you to reprint sections of work that's already published as, say, for example, an article. If you do get that allowance to reprint a chapter of the book that was a chapter of the PhD as part of this article, when that goes to the DHET as part and parcel of your bean counting exercise to say how many units have you produced, that article is not going to count because it's a reprint of a text that's already out there. Do you see what I mean? So it's really a shooting yourself in the foot when you say immediately after my graduate studies, I'm going to put out a book. That's a challenge. And again, it's the perverse effects of policy in the system. However, though, insofar as that is the case, a monograph still establishes intellectual authority in the international sense. Again, think about where you're publishing. If you take a South African publisher, right? Say, for example, you take a UKZN Press, or maybe you take a Wits University Press. What often happens is that your book will only get ever circulated in South Africa. But again, if you've got a good global profile, if you've got those contacts, if you've got that academic community that you're a part of, you can land a publishing deal with Oxford University Press that's going to distribute your book globally, not only to a niche market in South Africa. It's going to take your work to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, to, I don't know, Djibouti, to Kenya, to Australia. Everywhere you want to go, your book will be accessible because you're publishing with a major publishing house, like, for example, Oxford University Press. Similar thing with, what do they call it? With Harvard University Press, with Anthem Press. You know, these are major houses that have the network and distributive capacity to actually put your work out to a global market. Now, if, for example, you land a deal with a Duke University Press, another very well-reputable, well-respected academic press, or polity press for that matter, say you land a book deal with one of those two, Duke or Polity Press. What's nice about a global contract is that you can always say, in order to make my book more affordable and accessible to my domestic market, I would like to sign over African rights to a Wits University Press. I would like to sign over African rights to an HSRC press, for example. I would sign over African rights to a UKZN press. Again, these are only things that you can have the negotiating power to do if you've got the profile to do it, right? As a freshly minted graduate student, it's virtually impossible for you to go to a Duke University Press and say to Duke University Press, give me African rights, and give them to a publisher that's going to be able to cater to my domestic market and sell the book at an affordable rate for my market, for my academic market. So what you do when you have that global presence is that you're able to say to a Duke University Press, here's a book, give me African rights, let me cater to my community. They sell it globally. Wits University Press distributes it to the South African market, which also means it maintains your presence in South Africa. So a book deal is not in its entirety a terrible thing. It's actually a good thing if you've got the influence, if you've got the profile to be able to work it in your favor as a student. The strategy is that a book deal secures you visibility and subsidy through articles first, right? So that's the thing that I would advise you to do, is to say, publish your articles 100%, but again, don't publish any and everywhere. Don't. Be very critical of where you place your work. If, again, you're thinking about, NRF rating, you're looking for a P rating, for example, you're probably going to want to publish in a space, and there's been a couple of folks who've actually done some really cool videos about this. For example, Chrissy Bowie, Professor Chrissy Bowie, another good friend and mentor of mine, who has actually put out a very cool video to say, how do you get from a Y2, for example, to a P if you are a scholar who's under 35, I believe, and who's just completed their PhD within the last 5 years. If you're above those categories, say, for example, you completed your PhD 6 years ago, and you are, if you're below 30, so the P is below 35 and have completed within the last 5 years, and C, B, and A is above 35, and you've completed your PhD 6 years ago, type of thing. So if you're in that category of the CBA, how do you, for example, land yourself on a B2? How do you strike yourselves to be on a B1? It's by being able to establish conversations with folks who are in Q1 journals, who can be able to be your assessors, your global assessors, for example, who are going to be reading your profile, who are going to be reading your application, who are going to be making a recommendation to the NRF to say, give this person a Y1, give this person a Y2, give this person a P, or give this person a B3, give this person a B2, give this person a B1, give this person an A3. Do you see what I mean? So the way that you make those distinctions is again that question of who is your community. Professor Jonathan Jansen, I think it was 2 years ago, if not a year ago, actually put out a very, very interesting paper because he sits on one of these NRF panels, by the way, and I think he still chairs one of them. And so he just put out a set of reflections where he's like, why is it that a lot of Ps, for example, become B-rated scholars or A-rated scholars as opposed to C? And he gives you the different kind of networks that, or the different kind of strategies that you can deploy in order to have that. So the point here is, I think the point that I'm just making before I get too lost in the whole NRF rating system, the point that I'm making is to say, the thing that you want to do is that you want to secure visibility and subsidy through articles first. So you want to establish your voice. You want to put yourself out there as somebody who's making a poignant contribution to the area of research that you're working in. Publish in those Q1 journals. Publish in those Q2 journals. Make sure that your scholarship is in cutting edge, top academic journals, right? So get that visibility with those articles first, then develop the book for long-term scholarly impact and international profile, right? You also want, in a very real way, to establish yourself as somebody who is able to genuinely hold conversation with your global communities, with your global peers. Are there any questions on that before I move on to the book chapters? Sinoti, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. I think your discussion, I found it very interesting and eye-opening. I'm not a well-established scholar as such, but hopefully in future maybe things will improve. My just observation listening to the media, especially one of the American programs, 360 GPS, the host of that program, I've observed that his networks in politics and stuff are very well known, specifically operating from New York, which is one of the prominent cities of the US, which is obviously the biggest economy currently. And his guests, I find that most of them, they've published books, And then I'm asking myself, in the context of what you've just shared with us, why does it seem like America seem to be having a high book publishing rate? Maybe I might be wrong. Maybe my observation might not be informed by evidence, but it sounds like a lot of people are publishing from the States. Maybe the visibility is high there. Maybe in other countries the publishing community are not that visible. But maybe your comment in terms of the publishing rate in America, if that is factually correct, why does it seem like America, even in universities, I come from engineering and science, the books that we read that are prescribed, most of them, they come from America. It's very rare. I'm not saying that other areas in our continent doesn't have talented people, but I rarely came across a book, especially in science engineering, maybe in other disciplines you may comment, that was published from Africa. That is my comment.
Thanks, Sinoti. So I just want to sort of frame this. The two things that you've got to be thinking about, colleagues. The first is to say, in what context? Now, in America, in order for you to secure tenure in the United States, so they've got a tenure track system, right? Which is to say that you get appointed over a 5-year basis, and around about year 4, year 5, you come up for tenure, you come up, your tenure review is going to come up, and then they're going to say, okay, cool, do we confirm your appointment? Do we make you permanent or do we not? A lot of the people who make tenure in the United States are people who've published books, right? So there's this idea that your book is what secures you tenure. Again, though, the question that a lot of individuals ask who sit on the tenure appointment committee, ask the question of, where did you publish, in the sense of who was your publisher, right? Was it an academic press? Was it a commercial press? What prizes has the book won? What prizes is the book being put up for? What prizes is the book being considered for, right? So this is one of the reasons why you'll find that in the United States, there's a high level rate of quote unquote book publication, right? Because it's tied to getting the job at the end of the day. But again, a lot of the folks who do that will often do that because or through having had established themselves through research articles, attending conferences, being able to define where their contributions are, commentating in public-facing platforms such as the New York Times, for example, Washington Post, for example, various global news publishing agencies. They'll be able to put their ideas out there, establish their credibility, establish their legitimacy as global scholars who can then also come out with something to say on a particular topic over the course of what, quote unquote, maybe say 200 pages in a monograph, right? Because that's the other thing. When I say, when you come out of grad school and you say you're going to publish a book, one of the things that you've got to ask yourself is, the people who are far more senior to you in your field are going to ask the question of, what have you actually done that, we can be able to take seriously and we can listen to credibly? Yes, we understand and appreciate that you've got your doctoral. Welcome to the community of scholars. Well done, gung-ho on doing that. But have you actually studied the field? Because, you come to understand, and I often make this particular example quite funnily in the context of my own work. A lot of people always think that education differentiation in South Africa started in 1953 with the Bantu Education Act. It actually started in 1870. So a lot of the work that you begin to do, and it started in 1870, Lovedale College, James Stewarts assumes the principalship of Lovedale College, and he makes a distinction where he says black students should be put to wagon making, book binding, and agriculture, and white students should continue reading in the academic streams, Latin, geometry, Greece, and poetry, I believe it is, right? And this happened in 1870. And prior to 1870 at Lovedale College, there had been no racial differentiation on education in this country. So when the missionaries initially arrived in 1820 and they set up all of these different schools, black and white students that enrolled at Lovedale College read on the exact same path. But come 1870, things shift. So the point that I'm just trying to demonstrate here is that you begin to really understand your area of research once you've actually finished your PhD, because once you've finished your PhD, you're beginning to read a lot more in your area of research, and you're beginning to take a lot more seriously the kinds of contributions that are being made in your area of research. Because remember, you're not now sort of reading for the purposes of passing a qualification. You're now reading to actually acquire knowledge. So that's all just to say that you're reading to acquire knowledge because you're now a community member in a community of peers that are respectable, peers that are laudable, right? So genuinely, a lot of the American folks will probably come out with their books in that 3rd to 4th year of their tenure track, so that when the tenure review process kicks in, they can be able to say, I've got this book, it's come out with Cambridge University Press, it's come out with Harvard University Press, it's come out with Duke University Press, right? And to be able to say, these are the people that have contributed to that. Now, why do you see a lot of the concentration happening in the context of the United States? It's also coming down to the fact that the US is by far the world dominating, quote unquote, global knowledge production space in the world, right? However, China is surpassing the United States. If you look at the recent statistics, I think they were published in 2024. The statistics, or 2023, sorry, there were the statistics indicating, for example, the publication output for the publication rate by geographical context. So China became number one in terms of the work that they do. However, the money that's been established in the United States through the various book prizes, the various academic awards, the grants that they have, the endowments that they have from various corporate sector investment through Carnegie Mellon, through the Carnegie Foundation, through the Andrew Mellon Foundation, through the Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. All of these billionaires are investing in science, tech, research, and development, right? So the United States becomes this hub of knowledge production because they've got the money to be able to prop themselves up, to be able to drive knowledge production, right? And to be able to invest in innovation, in science, in technology, because they've got this kind of support from their side. Now, if you think about the African continent, and this is just to conclude the question, this is just to conclude my response to Sinoti's question. If you think about the African continent, South Africa is the most sophisticated science and knowledge economy on the entire African continent. Like, we literally are the most sophisticated. We have by far the most number of public universities that are publicly funded, that are well functional, that are oiled to the machine, that compete in global world rankings in very, very serious ways, right? So in the context of the continent, South Africa becomes that space of science innovation precisely because we're able to attract foreign investment into our science system. We're able to also garner domestic investment from our government and from the private sector. If you go to the context of the global north, the United States of America becomes that space because, again, of the different foundations that have dedicated themselves to funding science and innovation in the context of the United States. And so that's why you see a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the knowledge production coming out of the USA. But again, not to distract us from the question, it's important for you as a scholar, as you're sitting in this room with us this afternoon, to ask yourself critical questions of how do I define my profile? What areas of research do I invest myself in? What do I want to be known for in the areas of research that I work on? And more importantly, what community am I joining? And as I said, I think it was Damilola's question that sort of sparked this. It's important to say, when you're not seeing a conversation happening, when you're not seeing the scholarship in your area of research happening, ask yourself the question of, am I limiting myself by saying I'm only going to read to the year 2000, for example? What happens if I go to 1950? What happens if I go to 1900? What happens if I go back to 1850 in the context of reading this area of research that I'm working on? So it's important. It's really, really important. I know your advisors will say to you, no, the scholarship is outdated. No, that's this, that's the other. That's a lot of academics sometimes will say things without understanding the history of where those classifications of quote unquote outdated scholarship actually come from. And it was just the humanities, social sciences, and the arts chasing the prestige of the sciences without actually appreciating that in those disciplines of the arts, humanities, and social sciences, they become disciplines precisely because they date back to the 1300s at the establishment of institutions such as your Cambridges, your Oxfords, your Harvard universities. So it is crucial, it is absolutely fundamentally crucial that you read beyond the scope of 5 years, because really, as I say, a lot of folks will tell you education, racial differentiation in South Africa starts in 1953. It doesn't. And that's because people are not reading to the 1870s. They're not reading to the 1850s, which are going to give you an indication of what the education landscape of South Africa looked like before that decision of 1870 at Lovedale College out in the Eastern Cape. Any further questions, colleagues, before I move on to book chapters? I'm also checking out my time here. I don't want to cheat you guys out of a bit of a discussion on book chapters, but I do want to find out if there are any further questions on what we've discussed so long.
Sinoti, I see your mic is unmuted. Did you
No,
want to?
no,
you
sorry,
contribute?
I'm covered. No,
Oh,
you can
covered,
go on.
Sinoti.
I'm covered.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
perfect.
Prof. Thank you.
All right, perfect, Prof. You can proceed, Prof. Thank you.
All right, so I want to now go to book chapters. Now, this is going to be an interesting one, right? So if again you look at the context of South Africa versus the context of the North American Academy, you're going to see that in the North American Academy, there are very few. Now the thing is, okay, let me contextualize this. Let me contextualize this. I did my postdoc training at Harvard University over the 2022-2023 academic year. And I spent an academic year on campus. So their year runs over 2 years. Their one academic year runs from the fall of 2022 into the spring of 2023. So they go off, as you very well know, for that 3-month-long summer, and then they come back in the winter. They study in the winter in that context. Now, what I observed when I was at Harvard University was that in South Africa, a lot of people have these great anthologies that they put together. You know, every now and then you're being invited, oh, I'm editing a volume, I'm editing a book, please contribute to this, please contribute to that, please contribute, please contribute, please contribute. If you want to be able to be legible to the global north, you've got to ask yourself the question of what legibility markers do I use for them to be able to recognize me, right? So you'll notice, for example, that a lot of the academics in the US, the UK is a bit of a different context, but a lot of the academics in the US don't do edited volumes. It's once in a blue moon that you will have an edited volume coming out from a set of academics. And more often than not, an edited volume comes out at a watershed moment, right? So you'll see, for example, the Marxists in the 1970s, for example, where Gayatri Spivak gave that exciting and seminal text, Can the Subaltern Speak? That was a conversation or a contribution around cultural materialism and the whole influence of Marxism and cultural materialism as it was manifesting in the context of the global north and the shifts that were happening as a result of the Cold War. So it's usually global shared moments like ruptures in political circles that will kind of give these major collections that people contribute to. If you think about the feminist movement, right, where Kimberly Crenshaw contributed her exceptionally pivotal text, what is it, on intersectionality, right? That was another moment where Afrofeminists in the context of the United States sort of were resisting in the early 1990s what they saw as an imposition that was coming from a variety of social pressures or social stakeholders, and Black women wanted to define themselves outside of those particular parameters, right? So you have these multiple watershed moments that culminate in these famous edited collections that we then see. And those edited collections often indicate a network of people who are thinking about similar problems and who are invested in contributing. The one thing that the Northerners do get right is that they produce handbooks, right? So you'll have the Sage Handbook, for example, on, what is it, on African philosophy. You'll have the Palgrave Handbook on feminist epistemology. You will have the Routledge Handbook on white studies. So those guys do handbooks. They don't just do an edited volume just out of, forgive my French, they don't just do them for shits and giggles. They don't, right? It's a watershed moment. It is a historical moment. It is a moment that crystallizes what is happening in that particular context. And so you have a collection of voices coming together to contribute to that. This is all just to press upon you and to drive the point home that chapters in edited volumes often don't count as strongly toward DHET subsidy unless the publisher, of course, is accredited, right? So if you have got an accredited publisher, you do have a subsidy coming out for that. But again, if you're thinking about legibility in the global north, these politics have to be in your mind. Have you contributed to a handbook, or are you contributing to an edited collection? What's the distinction between those two? If you're wanting to apply, for example, for a postdoc, if you're wanting to apply for a job opportunity in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, again, as I say, Germany and the UK are a bit different. But these are the kind of things that you've got to think about, is to say, if I give my CV to somebody who's sitting at Harvard University, who's a professor at Harvard University, will they be able to follow will they be able to see the things that they need to see on my CV that can get me a foot in at Harvard University? That's what you need to be thinking about if you do want those opportunities. And as I say, a lot of folks tend to contribute to handbooks. Now, think about the question of who contributes to handbooks. Handbooks are critical people who are actually leading experts in their fields. I've just recently actually been asked by Anthem Press to edit a handbook on critical pedagogies. Again, the people who contribute, who edit handbooks, are people who are critical global voices in the spaces that they're working in. And so if you're in a handbook, that means that you're part and parcel of that particular network. Now, book chapters in edited volumes, whether they be in handbooks or in anthologies, are crucial for networking, right? And again, remember what we spoke about earlier, which is to say, before you put out your book, you need to have a community that will be able to engage with your scholarship. Building relationship with senior scholars is one way of doing this by contributing to anthologies. Contributing to anthologies positions you in thematic debates in your areas of scholarship, right? And reputation in South Africa, as well as the continent, of course, is very, very important here. Now, think about this particular question, which is to say, when you're thinking about your PhD, is there something that you can pull from your PhD that can stand alone in the first instance, but that can also make a contribution for you in terms of the broader scholarship that you're wanting to contribute, that you're wanting to be known for, defined by? Is that aspect that you're pulling from your PhD going to be able to fit into the conversation of an edited anthology, for example, of a handbook? You've got to really think about and wrestle with those questions. Now, the most important thing here is to say again, and this is the last comment, and then I'll take a set of questions, and maybe I'll take a set of objections if people are not too happy with the way that I've framed the discussion. Happy to be contested on these ideas. I think many of us have our own perceptions on the academy, and if you disagree with me, I'm happy to engage with you on that. What you want to prioritize is that you want to prioritize invitations to volumes by trusted networks, right? So you want the editor who's working on a specific anthology to come to you. As I say, here's the other day, the Polish colleague came to me and says to me, I've looked at your stuff. I know you're working in this area. You're thinking with the work of Zoe Wickham. We would like you to be one of the contributors. We're doing a volume, we're doing an anthology on Zoe Wickham scholarship, and we'd like you to be one of the people to contribute to that particular anthology. So what you really want to do is that you want to be able to get those invitations, as I say, from trusted networks in the first instance, right? Because these presses of the trusted, so from the trusted networks, you're going to have folks, for example, who are going to come from spaces, as I say, academic, reputable academic presses, commercial presses that have academic interests. Those presses tend to be more visible regionally and globally. If you're going to just contribute to a core, again, remember where we started this conversation, we said, don't publish everything everywhere, be discerning in terms of where you're publishing. If you're going to do that, then it's going to sort of, if you're going to contribute on the basis of invitations, and again, you only get the invitations once you've built up your name. You build up your name by publishing in journals, by attending conferences, by building a network, by building a community. Okay, so it's a processual thing that gets you inducted into the community of scholars, into the community of scholarship. I want to now just conclude by looking at the graduate to researcher transition. Now, in South Africa, graduate programs, rather, the move from student to researcher often hinges on reworking your thesis voice, right? So in most instances, when you're writing your thesis, you're writing for your advisor who's ready reading your work. Some advisors will say, I don't like you to write in the first person, so don't use an I, write in the third person. It's more formal to write in the third person. You'll get all of these kind of justifications, right, for that kind of work, for doing that kind of stuff. So you want to then shift from, I'm no longer writing for my advisor, I'm now writing for a community of peers who's going to engage with my work and treat it as an academic scholar contributing to a particular conversation. Examiners tend to push for publication, but the expectation is that you shed the defensive tone of the thesis, where you justify endlessly and instead write with confidence and assertion. And again, you're only going to be able to get into that space of writing with confidence and assertion once you've kind of created a sort of shed that particular voice of saying, I'm writing for my advisor. You're writing for a community of scholars who want to engage with you, not as a student, but as a colleague, as a scholar. And here it's important to have peer mentoring and writing collectives, specifically through whether it be, you gather under an NRF chair, for example, or research units such as our very own Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education Studies. There are other spaces, of course, that also give opportunities for graduates to develop their voices. Find those networks. And in most instances, those networks that you build in graduate community or in graduate school are going to be the very same networks that you're going to be calling upon when you are working on projects as academic researchers, when you begin to sort of personify this identity of a scholar. Those are the people that you're going to want to collaborate with, the people that are going to put you onto opportunities. They're going to say to you, I've seen this thing, apply for it. I've seen this thing, I want to nominate you for it. And also it's very important, and this is what I'll really I'll shut up after this. It's very, very crucial that when you see an opportunity, you don't just think of how is this going to assist me. Sometimes you'll see opportunities that are not in your area. Sometimes you'll see opportunities that are not necessarily for you. Think about the question of, is there somebody that I know within my community who can benefit from this opportunity? If there is, give them that opportunity. And I promise you now, the more opportunities you give to your community and to your networks, the more opportunities will find you in your development as a scholar, as a researcher. Lawrence, I'll stop there and I'll take questions. Yeah, I've been talking for a very long time. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Khumalo Seko. Really appreciate your insights based on this such an important topic. In that case, then I can just rather just tell the participants that we are now open the session to an open discussion. Rather, let's engage with Prof. As he has had, let's engage. If you do have any question, if you do have any contributions, please do raise your hand. I have unmuted everybody's mic, so you can contribute. You can tell us about your contributions. You can tell us your questions. So you can type in the chat box or you can raise your hand. In that regard, if there is any questions, please do raise your hand and please do type in the chat box. Okay, there we go. Yes, you may go ahead. Okay, Wale, yes.
Good afternoon, Prof.
Afternoon.
Can you hear me clearly, Prof?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, perfect.
Let me first appreciate you for these insightful sections about how we can go about writing in books and all that. I actually joined late, but notwithstanding the little I was able to get from what you have taught us this afternoon, I want to ask that peradventure somebody want to publish in a book or in a journal, and each of those authors or the publisher actually have different guidelines to follow. And at the point you finished your manuscript and you have done the plagiarism check on them, should the plagiarism check be done on the references as well, or it should only be on the contents? That is one. That is the first question I want to ask, Prof. Then second question is that let's assume somebody want to publish in the Springer and also want to publish in IEEE because they have different formats to actually follow. What approach can someone use so that by the time you want to convert from one format to another, it will not cause a lot of problems in putting some of those manuscripts together? Because I believe at times in the process of converting from one format to another format, there could be loss on some of the things that you're actually doing. So what would be the best approach to that?
Sure. I'll start with the last question, Olalekan. And that's just to say that the first thing that I would advise you to do when you're thinking about drafting a manuscript, right? Think about a series of things. I was going to say two things, but I think it's going to be more than two things. Think about the question of what is the aim? Say, for example, you've identified a journal. You've done your fact checks. You know that it's an accredited journal. You've done your SCImago check as well, and you've seen, okay, it's a Q1, it's a Q2, maybe it's a Q3. And I'm also going to say, don't shy away from publishing in Q3 journals, colleagues. Those are still very, very hard-hitting, punchy journals. So say, for example, you've done that homework. It's a Q1 through Q3 journal. It's an accredited journal. It's going to earn you a subsidy. You then go and you check the scope. What are the scope and aims of the journal? Is the scope and aims in alignment with what you want to say, right? With what your data is saying, with what your research participants are saying? Can this space, can this journal be the right home? If it is not, look for the right home for it, okay? Once you've said, okay, fine, I'm happy, it's a Q1 through Q3, it's accredited, it's appearing on all of these lists, etc., and the aims and scope is in alignment with my journal, with what I want to say in the article. Then the next thing is, the first thing that I always do is that I always go and I check out what citation are they using. Are they using Chicago? Are they using Harvard? Are they using what is it, ASA? What reference? And so as I write, and I don't use the cute little things that a lot of young people use, and I am young myself, but I'm an old soul at heart. But I don't use the tools that young people use when they write. So for example, I don't have EndNote, right? I really enjoy the pleasure of manually punching in my references. I know it's terrible. I know it's absolutely, absolutely terrible. But that's one of the reasons why for me, it's as I read over my manuscript drafts and as I edit my manuscripts, as I clean them up, it cements for me what actually is the argument. So for example, if you can go into my Google Scholar page right now and pick out any of the more than, I think it's about 30 some odd publications that I've got. If you can pick out any one of them and say to me, Prof, what were you saying here? I can tell you, because I cemented the claim that I was making in each and every single one of those publications by manually inputting my references, right? And asking myself the question of, also, are the people that I'm citing actually making any meaningful contribution to the article argument itself, or am I just using citations to fill up my page type of thing, you see? So that's the first thing. Check the accreditation, check the SCImago's quartile score. Is it a Q1 or Q3 or Q2? Check the aims and scope, check the citation system that they're using. As I say, is it APA? Is it Harvard? Is it ASA? Is it Chicago? What is it, right? Check all of those things. So that's the first one. The second one is, which also then helps for you from the shifting on the question of whether, do I shift, etc., etc. You don't have to actually make that question if you've done that schematic analysis to say, how am I where am I publishing? Is it accredited? Is it aims and scope and alignment? Because immediately when you put your first sentence on, when you put your first citation on, you're already conforming it to the journal requirements in terms of the style guide that they want. Now, the second question was around the style guide, which is to say, and it's important here, colleagues, what's fundamentally important is when you submit a piece of work to one home, say, for example, you've got a chapter, you've submitted it now to this editor, and you said to the editor, here's a thing, put it out there. Please do not share that chapter with anybody else until you've got an outcome on the chapter, right? On the contribution, do not take it anywhere else, which means that if it's going to Palgrave, if it's going to Springer, conform it to that style guide that the editor has shared with you. And until the editor says to you, I'm sorry, I'm rejecting the paper, then and only then do you begin to go back, incorporate the feedback for the rejection that you've got to say, okay, cool, where do I strengthen the paper? And then you reconform it, right? And again, remember, you're not just saying, oh, it's been rejected here, I'm now taking it there. You're asking yourself the same set of questions. What's the aims and scope of this particular home? If I take it out of a Springer journal and I put it into that particular journal, what are the aims and scope of that journal? Because no two journals will ever have an identical set of aims and scope. So you're not just plugging and playing, you're actually revisiting the argument, revising the argument, and then and only then plugging and play or playing it to the side. Do you see what I mean? You're not just moving it from one space to the other. The last question was, do I exclude or do I include my references when I check my Turnitin score? It's a very interesting question. I don't often use Turnitin. I think the only time I ever used Turnitin was for my dissertation and for my thesis submission. And in both cases, every time the citation score came back as under 10%, I think for my master's, it was 6%. And for my PhD, I think it was, what was it? I think it was, and these are quite large documents. My master's was 150 some odd pages, and my PhD was about 200 some odd pages. And it was a short PhD in political theory because I had done it by publication. So it was a fairly short dissertation and a fairly short thesis. But I don't often use Turnitin. I really don't. And the reason why I don't use Turnitin is because I was trained at Rhodes University, and at Rhodes University, the one thing that we used Turnitin, it wasn't to check similarity index. Turnitin for us at Rhodes when we trained as undergrads was to demonstrate to us what it means to build knowledge. And I have never, insofar as I don't ever pass my work through Turnitin, when editors pass it through Turnitin, it never gets an alarmingly high thing or whatever, because you learn, what we were taught was they're building blocks of knowledge, and you've got to work your way to acquiring the skills of being able to demonstrate those building blocks of knowledge. You're not just quoting for the purposes of quoting, you're actually joining a conversation, you're locating people in conversation, you're trying to contribute something original in your thinking. Throughout my undergraduate career, I've never had any particular, when I was training, I didn't have anything that was above, again, 10% was quite high when we were, so I don't know how to answer that question. Safe to say that think about how to use Turnitin, and I'm going to direct you to the scholarship of Professor Sue McKenna, who is the Director of Postgraduate Studies at Rhodes University. And she thinks very critically about that question of how do we use truth detection tools? Do we use them as punitive tools, or do we use them as tools that allow us to see the processes of knowledge building? I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Prof. That's actually answered the question. You actually talked about the first thing we must look out for is to know what category the place actually falls into. Is it Q1, Q2, or Q3? I know there was a time I installed one plugins on the Google Scholar that whenever I look at a particular place where an article was published, you'll be able to tell me either it is Q1 or Q2 or Q3. So we should just actually look at for Q1, Q2, instead of going to Q4.
I would advise you, if it's possible, especially because the majority of us in the room are still trying to develop our careers. If you really want a strong career, colleagues, as a professor now, I can choose where I want to put my work, because I'm not chasing after particular targets. I'm not chasing a promotion. I'm not chasing a job. Do you know what I mean? I'm fairly secure as a professor, so I can now choose. But when you're still building your career, it's very nice. I was sitting on a set of interviews the other day, and there was one particular candidate that just made me sting. And she was, from a rural background. She works in natural sciences, and she's been publishing. And in the last 2 years, each and every single one of her publications has been in a Q1 journal. And when your panel reviews your application and your application looks like that, trust me, you're going to get the job. So think about it from that perspective, to say, because the other thing that it tells us is that you're willing to do the work, you're disciplined enough, you're not sloppy about your work. If you get revisions, you're able to attend to those revisions. It gives us something, it tells us something about your character when you're publishing as an emerging scholar in high impact journals, i.e. Q1, Q2, Q3. Once you've become secure and happy enough, you can take your work anywhere you like, and nobody's going to bother you about it, I promise you. But of course, you don't want to take it to predatory spaces. That's a no, don't go there. But when, as you're an emerging scholar, it's really important to take it to strong spaces, because that's what's going to distinguish you from a vast array of contributors or competitors, because you're competing for jobs. In the market, you are competing for spots, you are competing for those postdoc fellowships, etc. So be very, very careful about where you go. Yeah. Can I take another set of questions? I see it's 4 o'clock, Lawrence, and yeah, I would like to yes, please go ahead.
Yes, Doc. There is a question in the chat box from Rumbizai. Which is better, to contribute in book chapters or write articles and submit alone? Do they have the same recognition?
Sure, Rumbizai, you're opening a can of worms there for us. Why do I say it's a can of worms? I say it's a can of worms because, okay, I'm going to answer it as an academic, as a scholar, right? It's nice to have co-written pieces of work because it indicates that you're able to work with people. It goes back to what we were doing in high school and in primary school. Can you work well in teams? Can you do group work, right? So if you've got articles where you are a co-author, that tells us that you are a personable candidate. For example, if we're looking at you for a job, and it tells us that you can be able to get work done collectively with other people. Don't let that be the majority of your submissions, though. Don't let that be the majority of your CV. So for what I have always done is to say that for every 5 articles that I put out alone, I want to be able to put out another article with a co-author, right? Or a set of co-authors, or whatever the case might be. So it's important to balance it like that, to say that you can stand alone on your own 2 feet as a scholar without having to rely on other people. Because if you're constantly co-publishing, if you go up for example, NRF review, the question is going to be, why haven't you done work on your own? Why are you consistently, co-publishing with other people? And again, it's not necessarily a terrible thing. It's just that we want to see whether you can do that independence thing. When I wear and I'm not an administrator, God, I'm not, but I love looking at higher education governance. It's one of the things that I actually revel in enjoying, in studying. What your dean is going to tell you, if you've got consistently, or not even your dean, maybe yes, your dean, but also your HOD, your dean through your HOD is going to say to you, you're cutting on our subsidy. Because remember that when there are two people on one article, that article ceases to be 1 unit, it becomes 0.5 units. When there are 3 people on one article, it ceases to be 1 unit, it becomes 0.333 carried over to infinity. Which means that it's depleting the amount of money that we're getting from the DHET as a subsidy, right? Whereas if you put together your own article, it comes out as 1 unit, which means that we get the subsidy from the DHET as the university, right? So as I say, the best thing to do is to say, for 3 articles, maybe for every 3 articles, I'm going to do a co-authored article with other scholars, And co-authoring also helps you to keep relationships in the community, to help solidify those bonds in your community, to help grow your networks. There's one particular article I did, for example, back in 2018 with a very, very good friend and good colleague of mine, Dr. Bagezi Legama, Dr. Lindogut Legama, who is now at Northwest University. And Dr. Gama and I have worked tremendously together over the years. Like, we have worked absolutely tremendously together. When I got the invitation from Anthem Press to do the handbook on decolonial pedagogies, critical decolonial pedagogies, the first person I thought about was to say, I want her to co-edit that volume with me. Do you see what I mean? She's got a funding, she's got a grant that she's administering that she got from the Europeans. She's invited me to collaborate on that. I hold a grant with the NRF. I'm consistently asking her to collaborate with me on that. So it really does help to build and shape those networks when you have that community of scholarship, and it betters your opportunities. It does.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, Prof, for clarifying on that question there. We do have another question again from Sekhule Moyo. And we do have another one again. Let me just check. Apologies for that. So I'm in the chat box.
Okay, yes.
So the question is, thank you, Prof, for the discussion. I've heard you regarding the conversation of maybe turning a thesis into a book. And you mentioned that one needs a strong academic profile and reputation. My interest leans more towards a clinical textbook in my field, midwifery. What are chances at this stage?
Sure, Kagiso.
And there's another one as well. Do you want me to read both of them, Prof?
Sure, and then I can just answer both.
Yeah, you
Yes,
can just
yes.
answer both. Okay, then the last one is from Sefula Moy. Says, thank you for the insightful presentation, Prof. I've always been interested in writing motivational books, but this session has made me think differently. How much time does it usually take to complete and publish one book, and what financial returns can a first-time author realistically expect?
Good questions, both very, very good questions. So I honestly cannot be able to advise you on the textbook discussion. And the reason why I can't advise you is because I've never actually done a textbook. All the presses that I have historically worked with, I've worked with the HSRC press, I've worked with Sun Media Press at Stellenbosch, I've worked with Routledge, I've worked with ESI. These are all the books that I've done. I've worked with Sage, I've worked with Springer, I've worked with Palgrave, all of the things that I've ever done. My commissioning editors have always been academic commissioning editors. If anything, there's one particular colleague who I've worked with, a very close colleague of mine at the HSRC Press. He's a commissioning editor. And he often always rejects textbooks. So I'm just sort of indicating that I don't think, for example, an HSRC Press would be a good place to try out for a textbook. There are other publishers, but again, I don't, what I would invite you to do maybe is that I'd invite you to do a bit of some research to look into which publishers take up textbooks, academic textbooks, that is, right? I know Nexus does academic textbooks in law. So you would have to sort of find a textbook publisher in your field and approach them and ask and have a conversation with them. And this is precisely because I think in my context, I've been. But again, I think the same in the conversation around profile and having the uptake of your work. You've got to think about those critical questions of who are the academics, because the publisher is going to make a decision on, do you have enough uptake? Do you have enough profile that when I do commit to this textbook, it is going to be assigned by lecturers, by academics who are teaching across the system in the universities? That's the only time a publisher is going to say, this looks like a lucrative deal for me, I'm going to sign you as one of my authors. If you don't yet have that, and not unless you can say, you know, I've got this particular textbook in mind. I've got 5 universities that I already know are going to take the textbook when it's out in print because I've got commitments from the HODs of these institutions. Then it can be, you know, then it can fly, even though you don't necessarily have that global profile. But as I say, a publisher is going to say to you, how am I going to sell this to a community of scholars when you are an emerging voice in that community? Do you see what I mean? So the same factors would still apply, even if it's an academic, even if it's a textbook text. Motivational texts versus academic texts. Think about this, colleagues. This is the one thing. Think about how serious an academic you actually want to be regarded, right? A lot of the stuff that is DIY type of stuff, motivational text, that sells and sells well, comes from people who've trained in psychology. A lot of the South African DIY writers don't usually fly, not even in our own market. If you really think about it, think about which text it was that you saw, Moyo, that resonated with you. Probably it was a global motivational writer, a motivational thing, right? Who's probably in psychology or is in psychiatry. You know, the biggest texts I think back in 2020 during the post-COVID years, during COVID and post-COVID years, it was The Body Keeps the Score, it was The Drama of the Gifted Child, it was What Happened to You, it was you know, all of these American psycho texts in the sense of its psychology, psychiatry, you know, people who have medical degrees in those backgrounds who then came out and did this kind of self-help motivational texts, and those were bestsellers. You know, What Happened to You featured, for example, on Oprah's book club and became this really snowballing thing. Garbo always speaks about The Drama of the Gifted Child because he's interested in child psychology, that kind of thing. So think about how serious of an academic you want to be. You don't want to be the lady who self-published a motivational text that actually only sold 50 copies, because you also don't want to be ridiculed or disrespected in the field. You actually want to be taken seriously. If you want to be taken seriously, I would say stay away from self-help motivational texts until you're a 50-year-old who's got extensive clinical experience, who've worked with extensive number of clients, etc., etc., etc. Stay away from motivational texts. What is reasonable to expect? Depending on which particular publication house you're going to find a lot of the commercial publishers. For example, Palgrave will sign you for something like $900 and some odd, right? So they'll say to you, that's a once-off, one upfront payment once you've delivered the manuscript. If you go to an academic press, you're probably looking at something between 5 to 10%, maybe sometimes even 15% of royalties, right, of a text. So they'll say to you, for example, you sign on, we'll give you 12% royalties once you've sold 1,000 copies. So every copy that's sold after that 1,000 copy mark, you'll get 10% of that money, or you'll get 12% of that money. So that's a lot. And really with academic presses, it doesn't change whether you're an absolute superstar or whether you're not. If you're an absolute superstar, it changes because you're then going to be talking to commercial publishers, and commercial publishers were going to say to you, we'll pay you a down payment for the book, and then we'll pay the rest once you've delivered in 24 months, in 36 months, whatever the case is. But for academic publishers, most of them will say to you, will give you between, as I say, 8 to 15%, 8 to 15% royalties once you've reached a particular sale mark. I hope that helps, Sehlule.
Yes, I see a thumbs up there from Sehlule, Prof. Which means I think everybody's answered. I hope you are answered as well, Kagiso. I hope you answered there, Sehlule. And I see thumbs up from everybody and applauses as well.
What have you done again today? What it's you, Namisa?
Okay, so yeah, I see thumbs up from everybody. So in that regard, if there isn't any further questions, I just wanted to thank you, Prof. Khumalo, Prof. Siseko Khumalo. Thank you so much for for sharing, or rather facilitating that session on writing book chapters and books. We really do appreciate your insights and your expertise. Thank you so much, and also for making it a very engaging and interactive session. And also thank you so much to all the participants who really joined us today till we have exceeded as well the time, but we really do appreciate your presence and your contributions as well. Hopefully we'll be seeing you soon, in further and more workshops that we always host here at the Research Capacity Development Unit. And also maybe hopefully we can collaborate further with you, Prof. Siseko, on other workshops as well that we host here, the Research Capacity Development. In that regard, I just wanted to a reminder to all the participants, please kindly fill in the feedback survey. As I've mentioned in the beginning, that we use this for our reporting purposes, and we'll also be sending it to our facilitator for the reporting as well. And in that regard, is there anything further that you'd like to add, Prof, before we can end this session?
I think this is a more offline chat, Lawrence, that we would sort of do, but it would be very interesting, for example, to sort of see from my side, for anybody who's actually interested in this, to sort of have a discussion about what does it take to imagine yourself as a researcher in your first year of your master's program, all the way through to your completion of your doctoral, and then how do you find your way in the system through your NRF ratings, your job applications, grant applications, etc., to have sort of a conversation about that entire pipeline, as it were, from beginning of your graduate studies to the beginning of your research identity. And and I think that would be more of a sharing conversation from academics who've sort of been through that. So if you guys could facilitate that, I think it would benefit a lot of our graduates quite well, so that they see that actually a lot of us tend to also find our way through the system. We don't come in it with complete answers. But thank you so much to everybody for your time and for staying with us this afternoon through the session. I really appreciate the opportunity to share and to learn from each and every single one of you. Thanks, Lawrence.
No, thank you so much again to you, Prof. Siseko. We really appreciate you and really appreciate your presence. And thank you again to all the participants. And also do not forget to fill in the feedback survey. In that regard, I'll now be stopping the recording and ending the session. So enjoy the rest of your day, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Cheers,
Thank you.
colleagues.
Bye.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye. Bye, everybody.